Built by a team with limited experience in the gaming industry, the original Twisted Metal raced onto PlayStation in 1995 and revolutionized vehicular combat games. A short single-player campaign and weak graphics left much to be desired, but these flaws were easily overlooked considering fun, high-octane gameplay and a competitive duel mode kept players engaged for hours on end. Sony found repeat success with Twisted Metal sequels, which released at a relatively brisk pace well into the 2000s. Not all installments were created equal, though. Developer SingleTrac helmed the first two entries, with Sony imprint 989 Studios leading production on Twisted Metal 3 and 4. 2001's Twisted Metal Black rebooted the property after the original creators reteamed for a comeback. In 2012, yet another reboot hit store shelves in a PS3 title directed by series co-creator David Jaffe. Its commercial shortcomings, along with the waning popularity of the genre, raised questions about whether the market still craved the likes of Twisted Metal. Sony's later attempts at resurrecting the car combat space proved futile, resulting in the cancellation of an unannounced live service game. However, instead of succumbing to what seemed a final death blow, the franchise reasserted its relevance through a hit TV series on Peacock's streaming platform. Twisted Metal's future in the interactive medium may have a bleak outlook, yet series faithful can at least find solace in knowing that Sony will resist letting it fade into obscurity like so many other tentpole properties introduced during the PS1 era. This is the rise and fall of Twisted Metal.
God of War begins with Kratos, who has climbed to the top of the highest mountain in Athens in ancient Greece, and he has this line. He says, "Not even the gods of Olympus can save me now." And with that, he takes a step and he throws himself off the mountain, and right before he hits the ground, we flash back 3 weeks before, and that's really the game that you play.
Best known for creating the award-winning God of War series, David Jaffe originally moved to Los Angeles to study filmmaking at the University of Southern California. With graduation came aspirations of breaking into Hollywood as a director. Ultimately, tight funds necessitated a job search that landed him a QA testing gig at Sony ImageSoft. The industry's infancy during the early 1990s allowed for rapid expansion, facilitating opportunities that helped newcomers climb the ranks. For Jaffe, such a chance presented itself when he signed on as a designer for Mickey Mania, the timeless adventures of Mickey Mouse. The platformer's success kick-started an illustrious career, since an impressed Sony soon thereafter offered Jaffe a lead designer role. His first order of business involved a trip to Utah with Sony executives and his design partner, Alan Becker. There, the crew met with computer graphics firm Evans & Sutherland, specifically to get a glimpse at then up-and-coming 3D technology, as well as talk shop about the tech company's interest in producing 3D games. Development studio SingleTrac had opened its doors around this period, primarily staffing engineers and technical artists from Evans & Sutherland. But before the real work could begin, Sony and its new partners needed to determine the type of experiences that would best fit PlayStation hardware. Interestingly enough, a rage-inducing traffic jam set the stage for what became one of the console's most popular franchises. A car drive from the Los Angeles airport after leaving the Utah meeting proved both strenuous and creatively stimulating. Slowly moving along Interstate 405 in bumper-to-bumper traffic sparked wishful thinking about having a missile launcher and guns mounted on the car. During brainstorming sessions for the new project then, Jaffe pitched a game with cars and guns. The Los Angeles team's unanimous excitement culminated in Jaffe drafting a design document whose contents received quite the surprising reaction from the group in Utah. Instead of doubling down on the car combat concept, the Utah crew pitched a pizza delivery game. Designer Kellen Hatch noted in Twisted Metal's Dark Past documentary that pizza delivery seemed a cool idea at the time, but he and his Evans & Sutherland cohorts understood the concept lacked iterative potential. Thus, vehicular combat dominated the core focus for the project, codenamed Firestorm. Production on Firestorm began late in 1994 with the newly formed SingleTrac leading the charge. The studio simultaneously had another internal group working on a game tentatively known as Red Mercury. its commercial title later bearing the name Warhawk. Speaking to PC World in 2011, former senior programmer Jay Barneson divulged that Firestorm and Red Mercury shared a codebase initially, meaning there existed a period of time wherein the Warhawk ship could be flown around the first Twisted Metal arena. Such a crossover didn't survive long since the developers later split their work into two separate codebases, though this hardly relieved the mounting pressure. SingleTrac, with its 20 or so employees, had fewer than 12 months to deliver two high-quality games for PS1, and the Twisted Metal part of the equation was far from a walk in the park. Building a car combat adventure from scratch without a pre-existing engine and software development kit caused its fair share of technical difficulties. Plus, according to Barneson, some earlier levels required extensive iteration. For example, the second and third levels originally fit into one massive, albeit incredibly boring, stage, given players would have spent an exorbitant amount of time looking for other vehicles to battle. The solution involved splitting that section into two levels and reducing their respective sizes for a more playable experience. Gameplay bugs cropped up during development as well. In fact, the feature that allowed missiles to toss cars around began as a glitch in Barneson's code. At one point, the programmer misread the weapon type and mistakenly assumed all non-bullet weapons were the catapult weapon, which could launch cars mid-air. Fellow developers made a fuss, so he issued the necessary fixes, only to be met with upset from those who couldn't believe he'd removed the effect in its entirety. Instead of deletion, they simply wanted the effect tuned down. But while the action-packed moment-to-moment gameplay thrilled SingleTrac, Sony seemed less enthused. Producer and co-creator Scott Campbell recalled that the father of PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, reacted to a Twisted Metal demo by inquiring about when the visuals would be replaced with real graphics. Given the short production cycle, the crew had no prayer of meeting higher graphical standards before launch. Sony Japan additionally suggested exchanging missiles and bullets with different projectiles like vegetables. Some developers were convinced the publisher had no love for the game. It didn't help that focus testing in the lead-up to a marketing push went terribly wrong. A description labeling Twisted Metal as a fighting game with cars culminated in a slew of hardcore fighting game fans participating in focus test sessions. Because of confusion about how the two ideas complemented each other, the testers tore the game apart. Meanwhile, internal debates regarding David Jaffe's divisive ending movies had caused somewhat of a rift. Though several developers viewed the live-action shorts as cheesy, others found them offensive. Twisted Metal 2's Jeff Goldsmith felt their inclusion might have hurt the first entry. Jaffe directed the shorts as fun supplements, but as Campbell put it, damage control was a necessary part of ensuring SingleTrac shipped a great product. The ending movies landing on the cutting room floor constituted a casualty of that effort. Despite the behind-the-scenes hiccups, Sony and SingleTrac unveiled Twisted Metal at the first E3 trade show in May of 1995. Studio president Michael Ryder expressed the group's hope of dramatically increasing the realism and excitement of games, a dream that would manifest in a car combat title taking full advantage of 3D environments and CD audio soundtracks. The over-the-top driving game more or less lived up to such a vision upon launching in November 1995 on PS1. Twisted Metal reviewed fairly well, garnering praise. The most praise for its fun vehicle variety, which included high-speed sports cars, a police vehicle, and the now iconic Sweet Tooth ice cream truck. The creative combination of destruction derby action and weapons worked flawlessly in many respects, save for the shortcomings from the brief single-player mode and unrefined graphics. Notably, the biggest acclaim came from EGM magazine awarding Twisted Metal with Game of the Year, an honor that surprised David Jaffe, who'd previously thought the title was a disaster. The numbers suggested otherwise. On an $850,000 budget, Twisted Metal sold over 1 million units and earned a 1997 re-release in the original Greatest Hits line alongside Sony's NFL Game Day and Warhawk.
We thought Twisted Metal 1 was a flop. We didn't know if we had careers left at Sony.
Luckily, it was good enough to warrant a sequel, and that's when we were able to really kind of pull out all the stops and do a lot of things that we wanted to do with the first version.
Brainstorming on a Twisted Metal sequel started prior to the first game's launch. The unfavorable focus tests, on top of Sony's seeming discontent, diminished internal confidence and slowed progress on this front for a time. However, the surprise commercial success and Game of the Year nod changed minds almost overnight. Sony ordered a follow-up, and SingleTrac moved forward with mapping out next steps. Fortunately, the developers received several more months of production time compared to the original game's 9-month window. Art director Mike Jackson and producers David Jaffe and Scott Campbell knew exactly which facets of the previous experience demanded fine-tuning. Improved graphics, refined gameplay, and better story presentation sat at the forefront of their thoughts going into production. Gameplay demanded the most attention, though. A realization partially driven by team members watching shoppers play Twisted Metal at in-store kiosks. These people-watching exercises revealed that players constantly banged against walls and often drove too fast, suggesting the vehicular combat adventure lacked a good pick-up-and-play approach. At least one development goal revolved around addressing this problem the second go-around. According to Jaffe, treating each ride like a hover car facilitated easier vehicle controls. Adding insect legs to cars constituted another consideration, as it would have slowed the speed of movement and prevented players from getting caught on objects in the environment. While the insect legs idea never panned out, unconventional concepts such as prioritizing missions over vehicular combat did gain traction. But the biggest gameplay adjustment stemmed from Jaffe pushing for deeper mechanics that would let Twisted Metal play more like a fighting game. In a retrospective with YouTuber Genry Perez, Jaffe named SingleTrac producer Hunter Luisi as the creative mind behind the suggestion to model new combat controls after Street Fighter combos, complete with D-pad moves for freeze bursts and other attacks. Skeptics questioned the functionality, but the team successfully mapped button combos just as Luisi envisioned, making for an especially tense competitive experience during multiplayer matches. Story execution represented another major shift between games. Despite spending $180,000 on Twisted Metal's abandoned live-action movies, Sony forked over $100,000 or so for movie shorts in the sequel. The second installment conveyed narrative through monologues and motion comic epilogues drawn by Lee Wilson, the concept artist responsible for designing the first iteration of Sweet Tooth. Jaffe penned the script, once again pitting combat drivers against each other in a Twisted Metal competition where the contest's creator, Calypso, promised to grant whatever wish the victor desired. This Faustian bargain guided the character arcs for each of the 14 playable drivers, all of whom had unique victory endings, though Jaffe and company purposefully avoided naming a canonical winner. The tower endings in Mortal Kombat inspired the decision. Liu Kang's MK tournament victory reflected one alternate universe possibility, while a Sub-Zero win demonstrated another. Similarly, Twisted Metal 2 spun off in different directions depending on who won Calypso's favor, yet none were written in stone. Such an approach ensured every Twisted Metal story felt self-contained, save for the continuous thread centering the Kane family, whose members would eventually appear in all mainline entries. Interestingly, the setting of the sequel's bigger and better story occupied multiple locations around the globe. Where the 1995 title dropped combatants onto the streets of Los Angeles, its successor provided an explorable world tour in areas modeled after New York, Paris, and Moscow. The first level even incorporated the LA ruins, where players could navigate through the aftermath of the previous game's chaotic competition. On their own, these locales held plenty of promising gameplay opportunities, yet a pitch from Scott Campbell truly solidified Twisted Metal 2's standout moments. A staff discussion at SingleTrac about the Paris level saw Campbell propose the user-controlled destruction of the Eiffel Tower to open up an explorable rooftop section. Questions regarding the budgetary costs were immediately raised, yet many believed the idea could prove a game-changer if executed properly. However, no one anticipated the sensitivity concerns, as Campbell assumed the graphic style would mitigate potential criticism. One member of the French press thought otherwise. The reporter visited SingleTrac to see Twisted Metal 2 in action, and in doing so expressed offense after watching the Eiffel Tower sequence. Instead of encouraging the segment's removal, Campbell said the journalist's critique fueled everybody to get more wacky. As a result, other landmarks were recreated for purposes of in-game defacement, the Statue of Liberty included. The gamble on both Twisted Metal 2 and the destructible landmarks ultimately paid off, considering the Paris level went on to become a fan-favorite environment. After a relatively short marketing cycle, Twisted Metal 2 landed in October 1996 for the PS1 before receiving a PC port 13 months later. Some reviewers labeled it more of the same, slamming the negligible visual improvements that supplied richer landscape details while failing to account for texture map and pop-in issues. At the very least, the fighting game inspired special movies as well as environment and vehicle variety garnered applause. PlayStation owners made no bones about showing their support, evidenced in the United States sales data logging nearly 2 million copies sold by the end of 1997. In 1998, Twisted Metal 2 joined its predecessor in the greatest hits lineup. It came as no surprise then that 2 more sequels launched before the turn of the century, although SingleTrac played no part in their production. SingleTrac's founders had no intention of running a mom-and-pop-sized operation. The long-term vision always geared towards expanding into publishing. The studio scaled up quickly due to this mindset and shrewdly viewed dealings with Sony and Microsoft as mere stepping stones on the road to a creator-owned future. In the weeks following Twisted Metal 2's PS1 debut, SingleTrac shared its self-publishing dreams in an announcement about going fully independent. Reticent investors stalled these ambitions, however, unwilling to finance fledgling publishing businesses in a climate wherein similarly small enterprises were struggling. Since potential investors wouldn't loosen their purse strings, company executives agreed. Joining an entity with capital seemed ideal for continuing their plans via different means. Hence, GT Interactive's acquisition of SingleTrac in June 1997. The buyout removed SingleTrac from the list of Sony's second-party collaborators, leaving its vehicular combat brand in a state of limbo. That wouldn't remain the case for long, courtesy of the genre's growing saturation on PlayStation. Jim Buck, lead programmer on Twisted Metal 3 and 4, claimed in an interview with YouTuber Kong that Vigilante 8 directly motivated Sony's rush to roll out another installment. As Buck explained, the president of what would become 989 Studios, the late Kelly Flock, had either heard about or seen an early version of Luxoflux's Vigilante 8 and didn't want Twisted Metal usurped as the de facto car combat experience on PS1. Flock considered the availability of internal subsidiaries and thought the Foster City, California-based group could prove a suitable candidate. After all, the team shipped Rallycross in February 1997, meaning it had a driving-centric codebase on hand. 989 Studios thus became the new steward of Twisted Metal, tasked with iterating on an existing IP, albeit without the bespoke source code and art assets. Comments from Jim Buck suggested some aspect of the original contract gave SingleTrac permission to withhold the Twisted Metal 1 and 2 code from Sony, a mystery clause that severely hindered Sweet Tooth and Company's final PS1 outings. The absence of veteran talent from the series further complicated matters. Co-creator Scott Campbell remained with the Utah-based outfit, where he produced another car combat adventure, Rogue Trip Vacation 2012. A December 1997 issue of Next Generation magazine alleged David Jaffe would lead Twisted Metal 3's development. Jaffe later said he only met with 989 on 1 or 2 occasions, specifically to provide feedback based on his experience. Having spent his career working remotely, the designer dreamt of developing a game on site. The next 2.5 years saw him pursue as much alongside an unspecified Sony America team. While 989 had its hands full with the third Twisted Metal, Jaffe and others toiled away on Dark Guns, an apparently abysmal overhead shooter that Sony supported with $2 million in resources before pulling the plug. 989 Studios, on the other hand, did not enjoy the luxury of time. Higher-ups wanted the next Twisted Metal delivered in under a year. Such expectations would stress any production, most of all one in which everything more or less started from scratch. In the discussion with Kong, Buck recalled the various issues that stemmed from time constraints. Something as simple as the turbo effect on vehicles never received final touches, for example. Buck used rudimentary placeholder animations for the original effect, but the clock ran out before he could fully flesh them out. The rush job similarly impacted car models, none of which benefited from directional lighting because they were all uniformly lit. Despite the creation of the new True Physics engine, even the physics lacked refinement, resulting in the absence of features like the ability to rotate vehicles mid-air. That cars constantly flipped over constituted another symptom of the short development cycle. Unfortunately for 989 staffers, the demands of a fast-paced production begat hectic crunch across the board, with Buck claiming he regularly worked 16-hour days for 6 days a week during both Twisted Metal 3 and 4's creation. Sony's generous royalty program made the long hours worthwhile in the end for developers, yet the effort fell short of expectations. The PS1 title arrived on Halloween in 1998 and was summarily panned by critics. Graphics had marginally improved, but were labeled grainy. Sound design needed additional tuning, and true physics enabled bigger jumps and subjectively better driving mechanics, yet couldn't compensate for the missing elements and recurrent car flips. Reviewers and players also lodged complaints about the unusually flat stages against Twisted Metal 3. Buck posited the lackluster level designs may have been an artifact of the AI rather than a physics-based problem. By his recollection, the AI was written to have a 2D notion of the world instead of 3D. A peculiarity that shocked developers when the person responsible nonchalantly announced during a meeting that each level would need to be lined up on grids. 989's first Twisted Metal outing did receive some praise, much of it aimed at the soundtrack filled with songs from Rob Zombie and Pitch Shifter. Oddly enough, the behavior of enemy AI won over series faithful as well, since enemy cars actually reacted to one another, thereby generating more dynamic firefights. Early in development, someone in the know told 989 developers that AI-controlled vehicles in the SingleTrac entries knew nothing of each other. If users ever witnessed two non-playable cars duking it out, it was ruled a mistake caused by the pair serendipitously driving on the same path and firing their weapons. But the lows far outweighed the highs for a contingent of fans, many of whom quickly dubbed Twisted Metal 3 the worst of the trio. The uninspired character designs, combined with superficial backstories and endings for all 12 drivers, didn't bolster confidence about the franchise's future either. Jim Buck labeled the harsh critiques a side effect of no one except 989 employees understanding the debilitating time constraints, technological woes, and pressure with which they had to contend. As such, those in the trenches prioritized course-correcting what went wrong once Twisted Metal 4 entered focus. PlayStation 1's lineup of vehicular combat exclusives had grown slightly more saturated by the time Twisted Metal 3 went to market. Vigilante 8 arrived in June 1998, and Rogue Trip trailed behind some months later with an October release. The steep competition and dismal review scores hardly affected Twisted Metal's sales, though, considering the 989 outing moved over 1.2 million units in the US and earned the brand a third Greatest Hits edition. Successful sales figures only meant so much in the grand scheme for 989 Studios, its team well aware that Twisted Metal 3 ran rampant with incomplete features and alienating missteps. Twisted Metal 4 represented a chance at redemption, thus polishing the previous entry's imperfections took precedence as development got underway. In addition to completing the unfinished turbo effect he'd created, lead programmer Jim Buck cited improving each vehicle's 3D visuals as one particular point of interest. The want of a finer 3D look necessitated significant cuts to the polygonal budget. So while Twisted Metal 3 artists had 250 quads and triangles at their disposal, only 80 were allotted in the follow-up to add dynamic 3D lighting and reflection mapping, embellishments that ensured each playable car sported a crisper appearance. Of course, bigger issues received equal attention. Developers resolved the car flipping headaches, tweaked the true physics engine to accommodate mid-air turns, and addressed complaints about the flat stage design. Graphical and gameplay adjustments went a long way in enhancing the experience, yet fans and veteran Twisted Metal developers would later argue similar care wasn't applied to rectifying the storytelling hiccups that plagued the 1998 romp. Sweet Tooth and his band of minions overthrew Calypso in Twisted Metal 4 and ran the eponymous contest themselves. The power shift engendered a redesign for the former, one that neither players nor David Jaffe appreciated. Jaffe lamented Sweet Tooth's new carnival barker look in the Dark Past documentary, admitting he had no love for characterization that cast the series' mascot as a joke. This approach in both 989 games implied no one on the team truly understood Twisted Metal and its ode to B-movie fare, the type of films that wore their hearts on their sleeves yet couldn't express it as artistically as higher-budget movies. Series co-creator Scott Campbell similarly questioned the direction of Twisted Metal 3 and 4. Meanwhile, designer Kellen Hatch said those iterations never felt like Twisted Metal. Surface-level characterization hardly counted as the only fault to be found. As Jaffe once put it, driving was never the intended focus. Rather, the franchise's cars constituted window dressing for arena brawler characters who required a touch more gameplay flexibility than they received during the 989 era. which ended on a higher note than it began. Twisted Metal 4's November 1999 launch on PS1 enjoyed favorable reviews compared to its immediate predecessor. Flashier graphics, improved controls, polished physics, and an all-around increased fun factor gave the fourth project a leg up over even the older, more beloved installments. And that 989 Studios managed such drastic changes under an approximate 12-month time crunch made the feat worthy of applause. But a different crew would lead the charge for the next Twisted Metal contest.
Pop the hood. The hood.
With sales numbers on par with the original, Twisted Metal 4 became the fourth game in the series to receive the coveted Greatest Hits re-release treatment. Sony didn't respond by ordering a fifth numbered entry in the wake of such success. Instead, significant changes within the corporation's gaming silo delineated a major shift for its biggest properties, Twisted Metal chief among them. In February 2000, approximately 2 years after merging its independent teams into one studio, Sony dissolved 989 Studios by folding it back into Sony Computer Entertainment America. The 989 branding remained intact for sports-centric releases like NFL Game Day and NBA Shootout. Meanwhile, company executives billed the overall consolidation as a preliminary step towards PlayStation 2's then upcoming arrival. Executive producer Alan Becker had already resigned from his post in May 1999 to break out of the corporate Foster City Group. In short order, he incubated a separate outfit within SCEA, one that settled in the Santa Monica suburbs and ducked the watchful eyes of Sony's higher-ups. David Jaffe, fresh off the cancellation of Dark Guns, joined the Santa Monica Studios founder in establishing an environment wherein open communication amongst staff reigned supreme. Yet, communication between Becker and Twisted Metal alum Scott Campbell laid the groundwork for their future endeavors. Campbell cut ties with SingleTrac in 1999 and founded Incog Inc. Entertainment the same year. His approaching Becker about potentially teaming up resulted in Incog's informal adoption into the Santa Monica family, which engendered discussions regarding game development initiatives for the PS2. The person responsible for pitching the idea to revisit Twisted Metal remains lost to time based on past comments by Jaffe. However, new hardware and a number of the original creators reuniting made reviving Twisted Metal's glory days a no-brainer decision. The struggles that did arise stemmed from choosing how best to appeal to series faithful and new audiences. Two disparate concepts were under consideration. Firstly, the Incog crew conceived Twisted Metal Road Trip, envisioning a throwback to the second game's world tour concept. Rather than touring Hong Kong, Paris, and other cities around the globe, Road Trip would have seen players exclusively wreaking havoc across iconic American locales such as the Golden Gate Bridge and Mount Rushmore. This premise maintained the cartoonish aesthetic from the SingleTrac era, evidenced by the concept art of Sweet Tooth donning an Uncle Sam hat. A second vision, subtitled Black, prioritized a grittier tone influenced by Jaffe's growing interest in darker themes as depicted in Jacob's Ladder, Seven, and the macabre works of photographer Joel Peter Witkin. Incog found value in both proposals. The public expected something along the lines of Road Trip from Twisted Metal, therefore it offered the most compelling route, whereas Black felt too out of the ordinary and risked breaking the brand's teen rating streak. But the latter implied creative possibilities the developers couldn't pass up, helped by the allure of turning Sweet Tooth into their own Michael Myers-esque slasher figure. Acceptance from Sony's marketing arm sealed the deal on Twisted Metal Black, permitting Jaffe to explore what he told Genry Perez was a newfound understanding of the underbelly of humanity. Patience in the fictional Blackfield Asylum enabled the deep dive. Calypso reappeared as the titular competition's devilish host, this time preemptively well aware of each contestant's desires. Interestingly, gone were the days of superficial fantasies, replaced by relatively unselfish and even understandable wants. The John Doe character requested answers about his past life, for example, while returning driver Axel asked Calypso to reveal the identity of his wife's murderer. Incog designed the vehicles first, then decided which characters, new and old, would be assigned to which ride. Such an approach didn't place any less of an emphasis on the narrative. Contrarily, Jaffe and his fellow writers went out of their way to ensure they crafted a world whose story felt dense.
2 years I'd been locked away. Not a day went by I didn't pray to God. But I knew even He wouldn't forgive me for what I'd done. See, God only has time for those who deserve his mercy. And I just didn't qualify.
A narrative team comprising David Jaffe, writer Jeff Goldsmith, and storyboard artist Martin Mercer began Twisted Metal Black's story development with fully animated cutscenes in mind. Limited time and money dashed these dreams, prompting cuts that reduced the cutscenes to semi-moving slideshows. Consequently, internal monologues for each character were considered the next best storytelling vehicles, hence the hiring of Paul Jenkins, the comics writer whose mastery of inner monologues in the Undead run for Spawn caught Jaffe's attention. The story followed Calypso pitting mental patients against one another in a car combat contest staged across a desolate cityscape. Like past entries, playable characters received unique endings, though the usual cartoonish Twilight Zone motif took a backseat to more nuanced and layered conclusions, all in the name of maturing with audiences in a zeitgeist where Max Payne and Silent Hill 2 also sat on the horizon. The characters themselves required a similar makeover, worthy of Black's darker tone. Sweet Tooth, in particular, lost the humorous clown overtures. His psychotic behavior ratcheted up to accommodate a sinister slasher villain in a demented mask. These drastic overhauls begat gratuitous violence and a mature rating, but not without some pushback from Sony marketing. Jaffe noted in the Dark Past documentary that several cutscenes didn't pass the smell test, as higher-ups lambasted scenarios involving so-called child-on-child violence and a mentally unstable preacher forcibly and unwittingly baptizing an infant. Since neither Jaffe nor the marketing group would budge on their respective stances, Sony's COO Kaz Hirai made the final call, resulting in several cuts that the designer argued worked out pretty good in the end, for most audiences at least. European players received a heavily censored version of the fifth Twisted Metal, which removed the story shorts in their entirety. According to Jaffe, no one informed Incog about the content concerns, so the cuts were made without developer input and only shared with said developers after the fact. To the dismay of fans, Black's 2015 PS4 port didn't add the excised segments back in either. Black's June 2001 debut on PS2 enjoyed nothing short of universal praise. Reviewers lauded everything from the incredible attention to detail and extensive replay value to the intriguing story campaign and level design, stunning graphics, fast-paced 60 FPS gameplay, and the return of special moves on the D-pad had also ushered in a new era for the classic PlayStation IP, stirring questions about how it would evolve for the inevitable sixth outing. Sony had a few big ideas loaded in the chamber, yet not all of them made it out the other side.
Welcome, Agent Stone. And you think I'm afraid of a silly water pistol?
No. But she is.
Dude, get off me!
During a press event for Black in March 2001, Sony unveiled a spin-off tentatively titled Twisted Metal Kids. The game, built on Twisted Metal 2 technology, promised a family-friendly car combat romp for younger players on PS1. Instead of regular drivers and their respective vehicles, kid versions of the popular characters would compete using remote-controlled cars. The official small Brawl subtitle debuted at E3 2001, where developers spoke about gameplay in more detail. One key takeaway was that child-oriented Twisted Metal required a fresh approach to weapons. Thus, bottle rockets and spitwads replaced bombs and missiles. Maps received similarly age-appropriate tweaks, with battles occurring across areas like mini-golf courses and playgrounds. Although some of the brand's trademark grit lingered in Easy Death Oven, a stage set on a kitchen island where stovetops proved especially hazardous. Incog approached the characters through the same lens, casting Calypso as a bully who challenged his peers to engage in the RC equivalent of Twisted Metal brawls. Ultimately, clever design choices couldn't make up for Small Brawl's flaws. The PS1 spin-off sped onto shelves in November 2001, 5 months after Black won over PS2 users. Small Brawl didn't benefit from its predecessor's acclaim, garnering poor reviews as critics panned the graphics, physics, sound design, and various other features. Franchise faithful and newcomers grew to appreciate what the experience offered, ensuring it attracted somewhat of a cult following as the years wore on. Either way, Small Brawl could not have been further from David Jaffe's original vision. Jaffe started imagining the world of Twisted Metal miniaturized after seeing Mr. Mosquito in action. The quirky simulation from Japanese developer Zoom let players adopt the role of Mosquito and buzz around, disturbing the lives of everyday people. What piqued the designer's interest was a stage wherein the tiny nuisance flew into a woman's bathroom while she bathed. It seemed a risque juxtaposition to an old concept that traditionally used the perspective of miniature characters for family-oriented stories, and Twisted Metal in the vein of Mr. Mosquito would have boasted an irreverent screw authority bent if Jaffe had his way. Thoughts of a quirky 80s teen comedy vibe gave way to concepts like shooting missiles at a bent-over plumber. Evidently, it wasn't meant to be. Small Brawl entered production at the tail end of Black's development, right as God of War started consuming Jaffe's schedule. And while Scott Campbell executive produced the spin-off, much of his time went to expanding Twisted Metal in other ways. According to Jaffe's talk with Genry Perez, he participated in a mere 2 or 3 meetings. The Utah-based developers gravitated towards a Disney-fied form of expression upon sinking their teeth into the project, meaning Twisted Metal's final PS1 outing hardly counted as the ideal final curtain call. Small Brawl almost opened up other avenues, however, since seeing the game on store shelves convinced Twisted Metal 3's Jim Buck to pitch Twisted Metal 5 for PS1. Along with some of his fellow developers, Buck departed Sony about 4 months after shipping the 4th game in November 1999 and established a brand new studio. He hoped the search for contract work would end when reaching out to Sony. After all, Small Brawl implied the publisher hadn't given up on its first console. Therefore, Buck believed he and a team of programmers well-versed in Twisted Metal's PS1 codebase would have no trouble building a 5th mainline title. The crew drafted a proposal, then spoke with Santa Monica studio founder Alan Becker over the phone. Buck said the Twisted Metal 5 discussions didn't get much further than that. Still, smaller side projects kept the IP thriving in between major releases. Twisted Metal Black Online became available in August 2002, offering a separate multiplayer-only experience that PS2 owners could access by purchasing the console's network adapter and mailing in the accompanying free voucher. Twisted Metal Black nearly claimed a 3rd lease on life in the form of a sequel, too. Sony acquired Incog Inc. Entertainment in August 2002, officially instating the Salt Lake City crew into the first-party family. Twisted Metal co-creator Scott Campbell maintained his role as CEO, all while producing the PS2 fighting game War of the Monsters that was due out in January 2003. By this point, PlayStation's classic car combat franchise had crossed 5 million copies sold worldwide, justifying the decision to follow up Black with a proper sequel. Development on what Incog named Twisted Metal Harbor City began in 2003, lasting long enough for developers to build a handful of levels. Details have long remained scant, but the core idea involved an expansive, interconnected world instead of the usual series of detached stages. Along with the series' patented car combat, Harbor City plans included an on-foot adventure mode starring Sweet Tooth. The project fell by the wayside at an unspecified point in production for reasons unknown, then eventually ascended from the ashes as part of Head-On's PS2 port, the Extra Twisted Edition. Extra Twisted owners could access bonus material labeled Twisted Metal Lost, which offered a playable behind-the-scenes glimpse at gameplay prototypes. To explain Harbor City's cancellation, the bonus content featured a note from developers claiming 6 members of the creative team died in a tragic plane crash. After learning PlayStation had scrapped their hard work, the ghosts of the deceased staffers allegedly sent a haunting letter to Sony, demanding their last earthly deeds be shared publicly. The hoax left plenty unsaid about what went awry with Harbor City. Incog went back further in brand history when attempting to expand on yet another beloved entry. Notably, the studio used the original 1996 sequel as a key point of reference for what became its final Twisted Metal. Having previously been shown in a demo reel at E3 2004, PSP game Twisted Metal Head-On formally entered the spotlight during CES 2005, offering a glimpse at a return to the glory days. Cel-shaded animatics for the intro were reminiscent of Twisted Metal's PS1-era storytelling. The physics system similarly harkened back to relatively simpler times. While new characters rounded out the cast, 14 fan favorites once more found themselves vying for Calypso's ultimate prize. Even Head-On's level design treaded old ground by rekindling the World Tour theme from Twisted Metal 2. Famous landmarks like the Eiffel Tower reappeared as a result, again inviting player-made destruction to the tune of a teen rating meant to attract as wide of an audience as possible on PlayStation's first portable device. For the most part, audiences received the game well upon its March 2005 release as a PSP launch title in North America. Classic Twisted Metal fun, fast-paced action that played nicely on the handheld, and solid wireless connectivity features turned Head-On into one of PSP's earliest must-have experiences. PlayStation players hadn't seen the last of Head-On either. The PSP exclusive shared a release week with the first God of War. David Jaffe recalled Scott Campbell reaching out to him around the time both games wrapped production, curious about whether his former design partner would be interested in starting their own development studio. Eat, Sleep, Play spawned from the renewed partnership in 2007, its first game being the PlayStation 2 port of Head-On. The PS2 version, dubbed the Extra Twisted Edition, featured the Lost Harbor City levels, Twisted Metal's Dark Past documentary, and improved textures and performance for the main game. Extra Twisted additionally introduced the 12-pack car and its driver, Severed Sam, the former a scrapped ride from the Harbor City build, and the latter a creation of Jaffe's. Extra Twisted would have to tide fans over until the next major installment, ideas for which Jaffe and Campbell started brainstorming while producing the Extra Twisted content. Two unused concepts in particular stemmed from explorations of what Twisted Metal could be on PS3. One with the most traction started taking shape in 2008 and tentatively bore the title Apocalypse. Wearing Mad Max influences on its sleeve in a setting where the United States had been devastated by nukes. Every stage would have centered on destroyed American landmarks, this constituting the crux of the issue. Twisted Metal operated on the premise that players were the ones wreaking havoc, not merely visiting the crumbling remains of already demolished national treasures. And while thoughts of a wasteland set Twisted Metal had floated around since the PS2 days, Jaffe revealed in a 2010 blog post that Campbell had little love for the theme itself. Ultimately, Sony encouraged Eat, Sleep, Play to jettison Apocalypse, presumably because it had already approved Evolution Studios' MotorStorm Apocalypse pitch for PS3. Another proposal that boasted a lengthy conceptual stage has long been known to fans as Revolution, though Jaffe doesn't remember the team ever giving it a codename. He simply called it Midnight Club Twisted Metal, a nod to the Rockstar franchise's influence on the idea. Two goals guided Revolution's genesis. On one hand, Eat, Sleep, Play had high hopes of expanding the IP into something that could garner greater mainstream success. Secondly, a new theme seemed a necessary step, particularly one combining Twisted Metal with Fast and Furious to make it feel more urban. Concept art for the Midnight Club-like project revealed the usually outlandish characters were superseded by stylish criminals and vigilantes. A reworked version of Sweet Tooth had a bald head adorned with flame tattoos. Other drivers were fashioned after gangbangers and Yakuza members, their street-level enterprises funded by Calypso Industries. The roadblocks that stopped Revolution in its tracks came twofold. For one, city streets felt incompatible with Twisted Metal's style, leaving the studio at a loss when trying to nail down the setting. Jaffe further argued that while he believed the concept could have worked, Eat, Sleep, Play lacked the right team for the job since the Salt Lake City crew understood little of street and racing culture. With the street theme fizzling out after 8 to 10 months, Jaffe and Campbell voted in favor of retreading old ground. Elements like the armored cars of old were back in play, yet Twisted Metal Black's darker approach and Head-On's wackier style didn't feel right. The group settled on a sweet spot in between, maintaining fantasy elements while remaining somewhat grounded. Moderate critical reception and meager sales were the outcome.
When I heard you were doing a new Twisted Metal, the last thing in my mind was mechs. What is going on with Iron Maiden? How does that fit into Twisted Metal?
Well, you know, I think on some level it was us kind of responding to...
Twisted Metal's first and only PS3 installment began as a downloadable PSN game that would have cost $39. Like 2007's Warhawk and SOCOM Confrontation before it, Twisted Metal PS3 was built for multiplayer-only gameplay. The reason being that Eat, Sleep, Play believed most fans were primarily interested in online or local multiplayer. Sony backed this play initially, then pushed for a single-player component more than halfway through production. Jaffe told IGN the marketing department felt a fully featured $60 retail title represented the best business move, especially if it meant the game also catered to fans who loved the Twisted Metal universe. Developers had reservations, arguing the solo campaign wouldn't make for satisfying content because they'd designed every technical element in pursuit of high-octane multiplayer action. The marketing team understood as much and doubled down regardless, promising an expanded budget in return. And so Eat Sleep Play's crew of 30-plus staffers pressed on, their faith in the multiplayer suite providing some solace. If Call of Duty's stellar online multiplayers could offset its mediocre story modes, Twisted Metal could potentially succeed on comparable merits. The multiplayer itself thrived on class-based team play, influenced by the rise of contemporaneous games following the same trend. At its core, the experience targeted a Team Fortress 2 meets Twisted Metal kind of feel, layered with comprehensive mechanics that would hopefully encourage players to select vehicles and game modes based on their squad's character and car lineup. Countless intricacies were also wedged into the weapon abilities, evident in alternate fire modes where one vehicle's regular missile fire inflicted minimal damage, then dealt 3 times as much when used as a manually controlled homing rocket. Even in the days before the esports craze, Twisted Metal developers set their sights on crafting something that bred serious competition. But Jaffe would later lament how the depth lacked a shallow end to onboard casual players and newcomers, many of whom never explored the mechanics past the surface-level combat options. The single-player offering hardly helped in this regard, given its inherent shortcomings due to time constraints. However, the studio went above and beyond when producing the story mode's movies. Jaffe refused to revisit the flash animation present in Twisted Metal 2 and Head On, thinking the style cheap and archaic. Stylized G.I. Joe The Rise of Cobra standees at a movie theater sparked inspiration for the new game's shorts. The rest derived from the slow-mo opening credits sequence in the 2009 Watchmen film. The pitch Sony heard and agreed to originally suggested each in-game movie would feature 5 to 6 shots framed in slow-mo like the Watchmen intro, all designed in a manner reminiscent of the G.I. Joe standees. During a single storyboarding meeting, the shorts ballooned into what amounted to a 35-minute movie with live actors and green screen effects. Twisted Metal's live-action segments did more than help supplement the content offerings. They also provoked the mature rating, though Eat, Sleep, Pray had targeted a T rating from the start in hopes of reaching a wider audience. The violence of the movies pushed the ESRB's decision into mature territory, but that scarcely mattered to hardcore fans who were just happy their favorite car combat series would re-emerge for the then latest console generation. A message hidden within Head On Extra Twisted Edition's 2008 release teased the brand would eventually return for PS3. Fans spent years awaiting further news, their hopes finally uplifted when rumors about a fresh entry began circulating ahead of E3 2010. Jaffe dashed those dreams, however, debunking the rumors on Twitter before doubling down in statements to the media. In a shocking twist, he and Scott Campbell closed out PlayStation's E3 2010 conference, walking out on stage alongside a sweet tooth actor riding shotgun in an ice cream truck. Audiences in person and at home were treated to a gameplay demonstration and the promise of a 2011 rollout. Jaffe justified his past lies in a PS blog post in which he bemoaned the loss of surprise and discovery afforded to E3 showcases before the rise of the online rumor mill. So when Sony approached Eat, Sleep, Play about announcing Twisted Metal and keeping the news secretive, the studio held firm. The announcement didn't disappoint either, as the developers sold hopeful consumers on 16-player multiplayer, split-screen, diverse game modes, choppers, motorcycles, and sports cars. After roughly 3 years of production and a delay to February 2012, the reboot, simply entitled Twisted Metal, crashed onto PS3. Reviewers and players applauded the rewarding gameplay and old-school action, although many felt put off by the smaller cast of characters, middling story, and select design choices. In the end, the game sold fine, with Jaffe once stating its sales success sat somewhere between not a dud and not a hit. But the writing was on the wall for Twisted Metal prior to the 2012 debut. 1 week ahead of launch, David Jaffe confirmed he would exit Eat Sleep Play following the project's release. Layoffs had also impacted the studio during this period, leaving behind 26 employees whose efforts shifted to a focus on mobile game development. Twisted Metal's next stop would be left entirely to Sony's discretion. And outside of Sweet Tooth appearances in the likes of PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale and Rocket League, the IP faded into the background for the better part of a decade. Amid rumors of a revival, reports from GamesBeat and VGC journalists in September 2021 claimed early production on a new Twisted Metal was underway at Sony's behest. VGC soon followed up with further details from sources alleging Destruction All-Stars creator Lucid Games had been tapped to helm the project. Supposedly a games-as-a-service endeavor slated for a coinciding release window with Peacock's live-action TV adaptation of the classic PlayStation romp. Subsequent updates in January 2022 alleged Sony had removed Lucid from the picture and handed development over to first-party outfit Firesprite for unspecified reasons. Regardless, the persistent online venture wouldn't live beyond rumors and speculation. As thousands of job cuts upended the industry's workforce, Sony laid off 900 employees in February 2024. Bloomberg reported the live service Twisted Metal game's termination accompanied the mass layoffs, with Firesprite staff being affected by the reductions. This unceremonious cancellation occurred just months after Peacock renewed the TV show for a second season. Success in one medium indicated Twisted Metal could still attract an audience. Its future in gaming seems less certain. Some would argue Twisted Metal owed its early popularity to the cultural zeitgeist in which it released. This assumes it was a game of its time, a brand modern players have little to no interest in seeing return. Not for a lack of trying, the vehicular combat genre has been without a lifeline for roughly 2 console generations, headed in the same direction as other waning genres like racing and action sports. But Twisted Metal's well-liked television adaptation may have opened the door for a range of possibilities. It's just a matter of whether or not an increasingly risk-averse Sony ever wants to take a gamble on one of its oldest properties.
To an end.
Thank you for watching our video. We'd like to take this time to thank, by name, the generous Patreons who have pledged to our Hall of Fame reward tier. Disco Cobra 2013, Ice Cold Water $1, Karu, Sauerkraut, Shuan Chinwin, Fat Green Dragon, and those currently subscribed to our producer reward tier: Boxed Mountains, Dave Oshry, DCX NG, DJ Redden, Edward Rains, Fallen Asterisk, It's Peanut Butter, Jaguar Knot, Jan Christofferson, Crash Course, Matthew McLaughlin, C-Rob Kaysen. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to our channel and backing us on Patreon.